which is on the topic of the threat to free speech and how to defend it. My name is Bernard Regan, and I've been asked to chair this evening's webinar session. Just by way of explanation, we will keep the Q&A open if you have questions that you want to put to the panelists, and we'll keep the chat available as well. But we would, of course, ask that people are respectful in the comments that they make. Just to explain, we're recording this webinar, but only the panelists will be seen during that recording, so you won't be on view yourselves. But I just wanted to explain that. One of the questions that's come up in the publicizing for this campaign is, who are you? It's a good question. We're really a group of campaigners who've been involved in a wide range of political campaigns, activity in the trade unions, involvement in a range of organizations, and during a period of time discussing the question of developments that were taking place, particularly developments on the part of the government. We were concerned about what we see as a growing attack on the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, which has really been shown in the legislation which has gone through Parliament in recent months and is on the statute book, and some which is already going through now through committee stages and being processed. And in addition to that, what we've seen from this government is a very virulent attack on a wide range of campaigners trying to discredit them and building some of those attitudes into the legislation. And I'm sure that will be part of the discussion that we'll have this evening. When we discussed this, we thought it was really important that the question of freedom of speech and freedom of expression should be defended and that it needed to be voiced strongly. We felt in particularly that actually people from the left and progressive campaigners should be championing the question of free speech, because historically it has been from the left, from progressive voices, that free speech has been defended. And that's why we wanted to have this webinar tonight, and why we wanted to put out the statement that we did, a statement which gathered very quickly support from a wide number of people, including people in the public domain, people like Ken Loach, Michael Rosen, but also activists in other fields, people like Selina Todd, Kim Longinetto, Susie Wooldridge, Victoria Britton, and others, but people like Tariq Ali, political campaigners from a wide range, a wide spectrum, and includes also notable academics like Ilan Pape and Noor Masalha, and others who are concerned about the developments and the implications of some of the government's policies for what is happening in the academic field. So it was really a wide group of people who felt it was important to make this statement. And incidentally, I should add to that, John Hendy QC, Lord Hendy as he is now, who sent an apology that he can't be with us at this meeting, but was one of the first signatories to add his name to the statement that we made. And I'm sure we all wish him well for the bill which he is putting through the House of Lords now to defend workers' rights. I think it's a very important statement and policy that he's pursuing. So we wish him every success in that. As I said, our concerns stemmed primarily from the attack that the government has launched on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. We've seen that from a range of government ministers who have attacked in a whole series of fields. Gavin Williamson, the minister who's Secretary of State for Education, attacking universities and threatening them that unless they adopted the IHRA, they would be subject to questioning about their funding. We've seen Williamson as well raising issues to do with schools and about what is taught in schools and how it is taught. We've seen Oliver Dowden, the culture minister, launching a very direct attack, really challenging the Black Lives Matter campaign, saying to directors of museums and curators in museums that they should be careful about how they curate material and present British history, because they should remember, and he says this in a letter which went to all of them, that they should remember that they are funded by taxpayers' money. It's a very clear threat that funding may be withdrawn if the government thinks that they are not conforming to the narrative, if you like, that the British government wants to portray. And we've seen other comments from other ministers, people like Priti Patel attacking Black Lives Matter. We've seen it from Kebede, another equalities minister, who launched an attack on Extinction Rebellion and made a comment saying that we didn't want people from these organizations or the material they produced to find their way into schools. She described them as anti-capitalist, and this was somehow anti-British, and that having these sorts of views should be something which is actually silenced and is not allowed to go into the educational realm. And of course, on top of that, we've seen measures being introduced which are strengthening the capacity of the state to actually intervene and to silence voices. We've seen that with the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, which is now on the statutes book. And I have to say, to their shame, the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, did not oppose. But it's an act which legitimizes the spying by undercover police officers. And I'm no doubt that we'll hear about that this evening. But it was taking place in Parliament, and that was passed in Parliament at the very same time that the inquiry under Lord Mitting is being conducted to look into the record of spy cops, where more than 1,000 organizations were spied upon by undercover police officers, including large numbers of trade unionists who found their way onto lists which prevented them getting employment, particularly in the building industry. And that went across a wide spectrum of people, like other people who are on this panel this evening. I also crop up in this spy cops issue. We've seen, as well as that, that with the regulations that have been introduced with regard to COVID, we've seen them actually being used to silence people and prevent people demonstrating. We saw it with the tragic incidents of the murder of Sarah Everard and the vigil that was held, where that was closed down on spurious grounds that it was somehow problematic because of COVID. And we saw a psychiatric nurse in Manchester who organised the demonstration against the government's proposal for a 1% pay increase, actually being fined £10,000 for organising that demonstration. So there are already other measures that are coming in, and of course that's even going to be tightened with the proposals that are contained in the legislation, the Police Crime and Court Sentencing Bill, which is now in Parliament, that says, for example, that the police can ban a demonstration if they consider that it's causing annoyance or a nuisance. And it's increased the fines that can be imposed on people for taking part in those any demonstrations. And it says also that people can be fined if they should have known that the actions were in contravention of proposals by the bill. It's hidden away in a piece of legislation, which, as I say, is now going through Parliament. It's not yet law, but it's a 300-page document which the Institute of Employment Rights described as a Trojan horse, because it has all sorts of things hidden away in it, including restrictions that will impact very much on the Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities by way of criminalising the trespass and allowing the police to confiscate and to take away their property if fines are not paid. So there's a whole host of issues that are contained within that. And that's just a brief summary of an offensive which is taking place from the government in terms of legislation, in terms of the political climate that they're building up. In addition to that, one has to say tragically that there have been examples that have taken place where people who have been campaigning and raising issues on a whole range of questions have been silenced, where universities have turned around and said that they're not going to allow people to speak because they are allegedly anti-Semitic, or because speakers are raising questions of gender and gender critical ideas and the issues to do with women and transgender people and issues of that kind. And those are things that I think the left should be vigilant about, because silencing debate is not something that we should be in favor of. We should be in favor of open, honest, respectful discussion, because only through that process will we advance and develop ideas. And the attempts to silence groups like Women's Place UK is an absolute scandal and an outrage, and should be something that we should be opposing. So this webinar is an attempt to begin that discussion. None of us have a prescribed notion of what we consider to be freedom of speech or how it should be defined, but we think that it should be discussed. We think it's important, and we think it's important that we take the ground of being the campaigners for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And I hope in the course of this panel discussion, you'll have a chance to hear those views, to put your questions and to raise issues with the speakers. So with that introduction, I want to move to introduce our speakers. I'll introduce all of them very briefly and then invite them to speak. First of all, our first speaker is Helen Steele, who was active in the McLibel case and is one of the core participants in the Mitting inquiry and the undercover police, and describes herself as a radical feminist. Then the next speaker will be Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, who is, I was going to say, Naomi, you're a member of the Labour Party, but you're suspended at the moment, and I'm sure she will be talking about that. A leading activist in Jewish Voice for Labour, a strong campaigner for the rights of Palestinians, and an active campaigner in the National Education Union. The third speaker will be Salma Yaqoob, well known to all of you, I'm sure, as a campaigner on Stop the War, a prominent spokesperson of the campaign, and someone who's a consistent campaigner on anti-racism and been at the forefront of that activity. We were to have had Loki speaking. He was keen to participate in this discussion, but sadly, just literally 5 minutes before we began, he said that he had a family emergency and he sent profuse apologies, but said he would have to withdraw. So that's regrettable, but I'm very pleased that we've had an extremely short notice. Daniel Kebede, who's the Senior Vice President of the National Education Union, a prominent campaigner within the union on matters of anti-racism, on matters of trade union rights, on matters of defending education, and also an internationalist in terms of his campaigning within the union. So Daniel, a personal thank you to you for stepping in on that. And the last of the panel will be John Rees. John, again, someone I'm sure most of you will know, a leading member and founder of the Stop the War campaign, one of the most important anti-imperialist campaigns that we have seen in Britain in decades. And John is also involved in the campaign to stop the extradition of Julian Assange and has been actively engaged in that. So John, we're very welcome, very pleased to see you, and welcome to the panel. I just want to say, in concluding my remarks, that I want to express a gratitude to the Morning Star for having carried 3 sets of articles for this, in preparation, if you like, for this discussion, and reference to those you'll find in the chat with links. So do feel free to have a look at those when you have time. So my thanks to Ben Chaco, the editor of the Morning Star, for having done that. So with no more ado, and having spoken for far too long than I intended, I'm very pleased to invite our first contributor, Helen Steele. I think you're muted, Helen.
Yep, thank you. And thank you very much for organising this event and inviting me to speak. I thought it was worth stating from the start that just because I appear on a platform with somebody, it doesn't mean I necessarily agree with all of their views. And I also recognise that other speakers who appear alongside me may not agree with all my views. I agreed to speak because I believe that society progresses through the sharing of information and concerns, and through open discussion to increase understanding of each other's perspectives and experiences. If we only ever shared platforms or communicated with people who agreed with us, nothing much would ever change. None of us would accept guilt by association as a principle in law, so why should we accept it in practice within social justice movements or on the left more generally? And with that kind of start, I just then say I've been active in environmental and social justice movements for almost 40 years. In the 1990s, I was deceived into a 2-year intimate relationship with an undercover policeman, and that's why I am a core participant in the undercover policing public inquiry, which Bernard mentioned. The inquiry was set up in 2015. Progress has been extremely slow, with the police seeking to cover up the extent of their secret political policing. But we do know that since the Special Demonstration Squad was set up in 1968, over 1,000 groups in this country were spied on by these secret policing units in what amounts to a massive and undemocratic interference with the public's right to freedom of speech and the sister rights of freedom of association. Those spied on include trade unionists, anti-racists, feminists, environmental campaigners, and even families and friends of people who were seeking justice over the deaths of their loved ones at the hands of the police or in racist attacks. I've spent the last 3 weeks in the undercover policing public inquiry, and even I have been shocked about the level of detail recorded about the lives of people protesting in this country. This included detailed personal information about people and their jobs, about the trade unions that they were members of, and about their associates, and also about who they disagreed with and who might have fallen out with. And this information was clearly stored by the state to enable the state to undermine and divide movements. All of this amounts to massive interference with freedom of speech by the state. And the recent Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act that was passed into law basically preempts the outcome of the public inquiry and seeks to cement into law many of the abusive practices which are currently under investigation in the inquiry. Moving on to the McLibel case, in the 1990s, I fought a long free speech battle along with Dave Morris after we were sued for libel by McDonald's over a leaflet produced by London Greenpeace, which criticised the company's business practices, including the promotion of unhealthy junk food, being anti-trade union, paying low wages, and so on. The trial was absolutely exhausting. It lasted 3 years and became the longest trial in English legal history. We were up against a huge multinational with massive resources, but in the end, with a huge campaign of public defiance, McDonald's failed to silence their critics, and the trial was dubbed the worst corporate PR disaster in history. But it's not just the state and corporations who have sought to curtail my freedom of speech. In 2017, I intervened in the bullying of 2 women handing out feminist leaflets at the Anarchist Book Fair. And since then, I have been subjected to repeated smears and attempts to ostracize me, deplatform me, silence me by the proponents of gender identity politics. Shockingly, this has even included attempts to get me no platform from speaking about spy cops, my experiences of being deceived into an intimate relationship, which was something that I actually never wanted to talk about in the first place. But I did it because, having become aware of the extent of secret political policing in this country, I felt a duty to raise awareness of what was going on. And it's not just me who's facing this attempt to prevent us speaking about how women's rights are impacted by gender identity politics. I've actually lost count of the number of women who I have talked to or heard about who have faced disciplinary proceedings, censure or sanction for expressing the views that females and males are not the same, and that owing to the disadvantages faced by females in a male-dominated society, we still need and deserve single-sex facilities. Such statements have actually seen women lose their jobs and be expelled from political parties and groups. And there has been a total failure of the left to defend women's rights to freedom of speech on this issue. Every time there is a reference to cancel culture in relation to feminists, there comes a chorus of mainly male voices denying that there is a problem with this, saying, after all, some of those feminists still get their articles printed in newspapers, so how can they complain about being silenced? But the fact that some women are still speaking up and some articles are printed in some newspapers doesn't alter the fact that many women dare not speak, and many newspapers and media outlets dare not or will not print the views of gender critical feminists, even alongside opposing arguments. And even those who do speak out still sometimes restrict their own freedom of expression in order to not be under constant attack. The net result of this is that most people, including on the left, have an extremely distorted view of what the actual arguments are about. Many young people believe that feminists hate them, even though we don't, because we don't automatically accept the concept of gender identity, rather than them gaining an understanding that we think it is vital to be able to name and fight the sexism endemic in our society. This whole no debate culture means effectively that there is no way of bringing people together to increase understanding of different perspectives and to resolve disagreements. And this has actually resulted in the fracturing of our movements at the time when we most need to be united and fighting the, increasing injustice and oppression in society. So moving on to how to defend free speech. In fighting the McLibel case, I learnt a few legal principles which are currently enshrined in both national and international law. Freedom of speech is the bedrock of all other rights. We cannot achieve social change without first being able to draw attention to the issue which we feel is an injustice or which needs to be changed. And our ability to draw attention to an issue is severely curtailed if we don't have freedom of speech. Freedom of speech applies not just to ideas which are favourably received, but also to those which shock or offend. If we think about this for a moment, we can see that the principle has to be true because we don't all agree. So there will always be someone who is offended by someone else's views. Offence can't be a reason for removing freedom of expression. Otherwise, who gets to decide what is offensive and what isn't? Interference with speech about political matters or issues of public interest is regarded as essential in a democracy, so that the arguments for and against different political solutions and the facts underlying those arguments can be aired. These are all principles in the European Convention of Human Rights, which was created in the aftermath of the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the Second World War. And it was created in an effort to prevent the serious human rights violations which had occurred from happening again. I'm aware that the existence of these rights in law, whether nationally or internationally, doesn't mean that they are always applied in practice. But in fighting to create a better society, we need to make sure that the standards of justice in our movements are not lower than in our existing society. Otherwise, why would people see the benefit of changing things? There has to be progress rather than going backwards. And to that end, another key right is the right to a fair trial, to know the details of the accusations made against you and to have the opportunity to respond and be heard by an impartial jury or judge. And in the context of a political movement, that means that we shouldn't be assuming the worst possible motives of other people, labelling them bigots and refusing to hear their explanations. Instead, if we want to create a better world, we have to remember that in order to create change, other people need to understand the reasons why we need change, and they need to be able to discuss the kind of change we all want to see. We are up against the forces of the state and the rich and powerful, and in order to create significant and lasting change, we have to build mass movements. To do that, we have to convince other people that there are better ways of running society. We can't build mass movements if we only speak to those who already agree with us. Another key lesson that I've learned from what I know of undercover policing is that spy cops want to create division. They know that by dividing us, we will not have the strength to create lasting change and progress. United we stand, divided we fall, as we all know. We should learn from this that whether division is being created by spy cops or by those amongst us, the only solution is to actually talk to each other and try to understand each other's perspectives and work to change minds with rational arguments. The fear of being publicly denounced for getting something wrong or for guilt by association acts as a barrier to many people expressing their views or getting involved in political movements. It stifles people's political development and understanding of issues if they feel too afraid to even ask questions, let alone tentatively offer an opinion in case they be ostracised. So we need to make sure that we don't assume the worst motives when other people express opinions we don't agree with. We have to welcome them into our movements and discuss, acknowledge, discussions. Acknowledge that people's experiences and knowledge differ and encourage growth of both our minds and our political movements. Finally, I just wanted to encourage people to learn more about undercover policing, to check out the Campaign Against Police Surveillance website and the Police Spies Out of Lives website to understand the nature of the state interference in our freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. That was an excellent start to the discussion, and I think framed many of the issues that we really want to tackle extremely well. So thank you indeed for that. Our next speaker is going to be Salma Yaqoob. Salma.
Thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. It's a real privilege to join you. And coming after Helen, who spoke so movingly, not just about her personal experience, but the resilience that she's shown and the insights and the analysis that she's just shared for us as a wider movement. So thank you, Helen, for that. I myself had to think not just twice, but at least 10 times before agreeing to be on this panel, because for me too, these are not academic or hypothetical issues. Being a visible minority woman in a public space means I already get a lot of nonsense projected onto me, whether it's about being an extremist or anti-women and being a misogynist or being homophobic because of assumptions people make about my faith. And onto that list is now added anti-Semitic because I'm an unapologetic defender of Palestinian rights. So this idea that you can speak up but not have your job affected or your reputation affected has gone now. I mean, it's showing my age, but I became active politically way back in 2001, and my motivation was to stand up for people who didn't have the right to speak up, the Afghan women who were about to be bombed by Bush and Blair following the awful attacks in 9/11. And I really thought about the fact that I have privilege having been born in this country, being able to have a voice. There was nothing to stop us from protesting. The barrier was our own inertia or lack of motivation. So it was a case of just let people know what's going on and let's come together. And it's so sad that, you know, almost 20 years down the line, actually we're having to stand up for our own rights to speak up, not just about, you know, the privilege of being able to defend other people who are less fortunate than ourselves. You know, we have had a proud tradition of debate, dissent, freedom, democracy. England is still referred to as the mother of democracy. I know we're all cynics here. We know the other side of, you know, British history, but let's give credit where it's due as well. In fact, it was those huge mobilizations, you know, the biggest demonstration in human history, actually, February 15th, 2003, which inspired the Arab Spring. You know, people were saying that not only are we inspired by the solidarity and humanity being shown to us, you know, you're giving us our dignity and humanity by standing up for us, even though you're not Arab and you're not Muslim, and it's your government that's, you know, paying for these bombs. So when it came to the Iraq war, but also they said you motivated us about the power of the collective and the power of speaking up. And jumping on what Helen's been advocating, for me, this is an absolutely non-negotiable, fundamental right and necessity. We are going to be no good to ourselves or anybody else if we allow ourselves to be stifled. So when I said I had to think twice and indeed 10 times before coming on this platform, because I know the kind of nonsense I'm going to face, you know, immediately afterwards. For me, it's still a case of there are other people around the world who literally lose their lives and are not able to speak up. So we have to keep fighting and carve out this space. And I think it's an absolute tragedy that the left has started to eat itself in the name of freedom and in the name of equality. And we become beyond a laughing stock. It's become dangerous because we're actually limiting our own effectiveness. In the name of identity politics, structural race, class issues are actually being sidelined here. And the same issues around the so-called debate around trans rights and feminism. You know, it's an absolute nonsense that we're in a position where it's either or. And so my plea is a very simple one. We must defend the space to not only have difference, but to actually make mistakes. To err is to be human. To be human is to err. You know, I have 5 kids. You know, part of their growing up and learning is to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. If we were to punish ourselves or our kids or people in our lives for the first mistake they make and say, right, we're going to have nothing to do with you now, that's not about learning and development. And that's why I was really pleased to see Daniel Kebede, you know, on this panel, you know, as a senior union leader. You know, he has so much power and inspiration is already shown in this space in terms of the attitude of the next generation. But in terms of some of us old fogies, you know, who've been around, you know, the social justice movement, the fact that we're having to defend our own right to speak, you know, it's not just an irony, but actually it's a heavy responsibility to ensure that that space is not shut down and to genuinely foster that respectful dialogue and debate. And I'm used to being called all sorts. And I think it's right that we don't make our criteria about offence. You know, when I say we need to defend the freedom to speak, it has to include people who actually vehemently disagree with. And the irony is I was one of the few, I was on a panel on Question Time, actually a little while ago now, when Calvin Mackenzie, that, you know, awful editor of that awful headline about Liverpool, you know, after the Hillsborough disaster, he was trying to argue against having a hate preacher against Muslims being allowed to speak in Britain. And of course, he thought I would just go along with this. But I was the only panelist to say no, because we know where this kind of action goes. You start saying people you don't agree with and don't like shouldn't be allowed to speak, and it'll come to people who you agree with, and actually finally it'll come to yourself. And we should be bold, we should be confident in our own thoughts, in our own analysis, in our own proposals for constructive change, to be able to take things on the chin where, you know, if that happens. And it's almost a sign of insecurity and a lack of courage and a laziness, ultimately, if we feel the only way that we can win our argument is by denying other people the right. But we're not even in that luxurious position anyway, comrades, because it's us who are being silenced in the name of freedom of speech. You couldn't make it up that this Tory authoritarian government is sponsoring bills, you know, in the name of freedom of speech, yet this is the very government with, you know, that joker Gavin Williamson, you know, actually threatening defunding universities who refuse to adopt the very contested IHRA definition. And just looking at what's happened, you know, over this last fortnight, the tragedy unfolding, you know, before our eyes, in Jerusalem, in Palestine, what the people of Gaza are facing, just speaking up about that, you know, coming under the label of anti-Semitism by some who want to abuse and distort definitions. And the fact that solidarity on campuses, solidarity in public spaces has now become so contentious that people are choosing to self-censor, even if they can't get it through an absolute legal means. It's working in a cultural and political space, which I think is very, very dangerous. And Helen alluded to how a similar process has unfolded around the trans/feminism debate. And so what I'm advocating is a very, very simple thing here, that we may have to stand alongside people we may not agree with, but we should not make this a right-left divide when it comes to freedom of speech. There are many people who may not agree with us on class and structure issues, but will defend the freedom to speak up. People like Peter Oborne, you know, he resigned as the Telegraph main political correspondent, you know, out of a sense of anger and indignation at how certain things were being censored that should have been discussed. So we have to reach out and find those allies. The trade union movement, you know, is absolutely key in ensuring that people have the ability to access these different arguments, have the confidence to conduct these arguments, and have the collective weight and cover, as it were, and protection when people are targeted. Because that's what's happening at the moment. The Freedom of Speech Bill will be used to defend people who say the most vile things and attack and silence people who are actually standing up for progressive issues. And we see this with the treatment of people like David Miller. We've seen this in the so-called justice space with Julian Assange, with Edward Snowden, even with Craig Murray, an ex-ambassador of this country who did such courageous work around whistleblowing, around torture, being sentenced to 8 months prison. So the message is going out across all sectors, to the civil service, to the NHS, to the police, to our campuses, that you have to be very careful in what you say, and clear lines are being made as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And what is not acceptable generally, when we look at this, are issues around environment. So Extinction Rebellion is now being deemed as some kind of extremist organisation which schools and colleges should not be allowed to invite in. The same with the anti-war movement. And some of us who've been fighting the anti-imperialist cause have kind of got used to being viewed in a certain way because we're seen as a threat to the kind of direction of policy in this country. But seeing nurses, being given £10,000 fine for daring just to say that the 1% offal is so pitiful, this just shows how far the line has been drawn and how sinister this government is. And that, quite frankly, the uselessness of the so-called opposition in not opposing this stuff. This is not constructive opposition. This is absolutely capitulating. And that's why it's so important that the movement, the wider movement, which actually has grown. And the only silver lining in this, I would say, and I have to say something positive and hopeful, I guess, is that the reason that we're seeing such an onslaught on so many fronts actually is because the general direction of this country is going in a progressive direction. The younger generation, when it comes to the environmental issue, when it comes to the anti-war issues, the huge demonstrations we saw for Palestine just last weekend, and I believe this coming weekend we're going to see, even bigger numbers. So when it comes to anti-imperialism, when it comes to anti-austerity, when it comes to the growing numbers we saw with the Labour Party under Corbyn became the largest party in the whole of Europe. The mainstream papers are not going to talk about this. But that was the real threat, the fact that it is going in that direction. All of that has depended because we didn't have the media machine. What we had was movement, people talking to one another, numbers on the ground. And all of these legislations, which seem disparate, actually for me, the running thread in all of this is to stop ordinary people being able to exercise their freedom of speech, which allows that energy to come together and collective action happen. And we know throughout history, whether it's the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, it's always about people coming together, demanding power, demanding rights, because power never just cedes power. It does take us having to collectively organise. And on that note, I just want to end with a quote from Martin Luther King. He said many wonderful things, but when I came across this recently, it again re-inspired me once again to never stop speaking up. And he said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So thank you so much, not just all the panelists, but everybody who's joined on this call. Keep speaking up, keep going. Right is on our side. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Salma. Thank you for that contribution. Can I just say to everybody who's following the webinar that we're grateful for the comments that are in the chat and for people keeping them respectful and paying respect to everybody who's on the panel. If there are direct questions that you want to ask, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll try and ensure that the panelists have a chance to come back and respond to those later on this evening. Our next contributor, very pleased to welcome Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi. Naomi.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Can you hear me? Nobody's saying anything.
Yes, they're muted, Naomi, that's why.
Not muted now, am I?
We can hear you, Naomi.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you very much. Right, my goodness, what an act to follow, Salma. That was a rip-roaring speech. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to thank Helen for making clear at the beginning this basic principle that sharing a platform doesn't entail agreement with fellow speakers. We simply don't accept the idea of guilt by association that many of us have fallen foul of over recent years. And thanks to Salma for reminding us about our privilege to speak on behalf of the voiceless, and what an irony it is to be having to defend our own fundamental right here in this country. I think we can take it as read what statement that Bernard alluded to in the beginning says about the vital importance of the right to freedom of speech as a progressive value. That is a fundamental principle. And along with it, all those other rights, the right to assembly, the right to protest, the right to show solidarity, to have access to justice, to have access to information that is not distorted and twisted. So the thing is that, as Bernard very eloquently outlined, all those rights are currently under serious threat, as we know. Our job as activists in the movement for justice and freedom and human rights is to defend those rights. And we have to do that in action, and we have to do that through the battle of ideas. We had some great examples just the other day of defense of these rights in action from footballers in Leicester, right? And then from Manchester United, and from the Fire Brigades Union, who refused to collude with the police in ending a pro-Palestinian protest, which has been an amazing story, and I'm sure everybody's seen it. So how are we going to deal with this threat of a culture of silencing being co-opted by the right? Now, already speakers have alluded to that. We've got Ben Williamson trying to impose the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism on universities, while at the same time the government is upholding the right of bigots to freedom of speech, as has also already been alluded to. Let's not pretend this is easy. It really isn't. Freedom of speech is not an absolute right. There are times when denying a platform, for example, to fascists, is justified and necessary. At times, it has to be a strategic and a tactical decision of the movement at any given time. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission recently gave us a dangerous example of getting it badly wrong, allowing a contested view of a certain form of racism, i.e. anti-Semitism, to be weaponized in order to deprive Labour Party members of their right to express legitimate political views. I'm going to put in a plug here. If you haven't read Jewish Voice for Labour's e-book, Analysing the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, please read it and watch the webinar, the launch webinar, which is on video, and we'll have to put a clip in. Maybe one of the organisers could do that. By the way, Salma, Peter Oborne was one of the speakers that night, so your reference to him was very appropriate. Before I go on, I want to quote from something that Liz Piketty, the director of the Institute of Race Relations, said at that launch. She was speaking at the ebook launch, and Liz made some very relevant remarks to this discussion we're having tonight. She called for, and I'm quoting, an anti-racism which is by nature international and compatible with free speech. An anti-racism which is not punitive, which is not about publishing individuals, which is not about personalizing racism, which distinguishes between personal attitudes and racist acts, between words that cause offense and words that are racist. She says that the EHRC and other political institutions, by failing to make these distinctions, have set back the anti-racist fight in this country considerably. The next bit is crucial, and it's not just because she praises Jewish Voice for Labour, although I'm delighted that she does. What she says is, I think the JVL report, this is our report into the Equalities and Human Rights Commission report, is brilliant, not only because of its defence of rational thought, but because of its clear and calm tone. It sets a benchmark for us all about how we should discuss these issues. It is educative. If we are to educate about racism and anti-Semitism, we have to bring people along with us. And if we do that, we need to create an open and tolerant political culture, one in which we neither seek to give offence gratuitously or cancel each other out. And I think those are very wise words from Liz Kebede at the IRR. So how does this play out in practice in our movement? Of course, I stress, as Liz said, offensiveness is not a virtue. You know, we should not seek to give offence gratuitously. Neither is it a crime. There is no right not to be offended. Anti-Semitism has been redefined to cover statements that are offensive to supporters of Israel and Zionism. And the result has been mass suspensions of anti-racist internationalists, including myself, from the Labour Party. And it is partly responsible for the destruction of the Corbyn movement, which we've seen over the last year or so. And the danger within our movement seems to me to be a sort of internalization in parts of the left of an idea of zero tolerance. We tackle disagreeable ideas by driving out, this is the language they use, driving out guilty individuals and silencing opponents. One section of the Jewish community, a fictional monolithic Jewish community, has been allowed to define its discrimination, and others are cancelled. Is this how we tackle all forms of discrimination? Islamophobia, Gypsy, Roma and traveller discrimination, transphobia, are all these kinds of discrimination to be opposed in that divisive and dangerous way? That issue, as has already been mentioned, the question of trans rights, is causing very dangerous divisions within our movement. So really, I just want to end by reiterating Liz Kebede's point. Bring people along with us. We need to create an open and tolerant political culture, one in which we neither seek to give offence gratuitously or seek to cancel each other out. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Naomi, for that. Thank you indeed. And our next speaker, and I'm grateful to him for having stepped in, as I said earlier, at the last moment, because low-key was unable to come along and sent profound apologies, but I'm extremely grateful to have as our next speaker, the Senior Vice President of the National Education Union, the largest education union in Europe, Daniel Kebede.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and it's an honour and a privilege to fill in for Low-Key's spot last minute. I mean, it's a vital discussion that we're having, and there's some fabulous speeches, but this needs to be a real key battleground for us on the left, the fight over freedom of speech and freedom of expression. It has been said already, it is central to building that unity, central to building the understanding that is needed for our movement. The working class is diverse, isn't it? It is black, it's white, it's LGBT, it's male, it's female, it's made up of all religions and none. So discussion and dialogue must be central to all that we do. And what we have seen is a culture created where things can't be spoken about, or we must be cautious about. And this has largely come from the right, but we have seen it also on the organised left as well. We've seen this attempt to stifle free speech on Palestine, for example. You know, we have seen attempts, and I've been witness to it myself. I've seen excellent women get no platformed because their views are deemed as undesirable. You know, we remember what happened to Esther Giles, and there are many other women as well, and it is highly problematic. Most of, you know, it's incredibly destructive, and it is something that we have seen grown in the Labour movement, and particularly in the Labour Party. And a movement can't be built like this. You know, we have to be very clear as a movement who no platform is for. As Naomi said, it is for fascists, and it is we use it as a strategy for fascists for a very particular reason. They oppose free speech. They want to smash free expression. They want to dismantle the working class movement and everything we stand for. So there is a very specific reason why we reserve that tactic for those people only. And as a consequence of some of the stuff that we've seen go on the organised left, we've seen the Tory right make themselves this champion of free speech, haven't we? And in education, we do see examples of this happen as well. You know, we saw that what happened in the school in Batley after the teacher shared the picture of the Prophet Muhammad. Toby Young and the like were, you know, with their Twitter outrage, shouting it's PC gone mad, where's the free speech, and so on. But I'm not going to get into the minutiae of that case, but where are those same right-wing commentators shouting about free speech when it's a young person who's been reported to prevent for wearing a Palestine badge, or a 5-year-old being reported to prevent for mispronouncing terraced house as a terrorist house? Who's free speech for who? Who are they talking about when they're shouting about free speech? But whilst this has been going on, we've seen the concerted attempt by the government to stifle free speech and expression, to stop discussion around things like critical race theory in schools, for example. Now, I'm not actually a fan of race theory. I believe in anti-racism as part of the class struggle, but our educational establishment should be free to discuss these things and educate about theories in this sort of way. What we're seeing now is a kickback from the state, I believe, to stifle freedom of speech and expression, to hold our movement back and force us back from some of the advances that we've made over the past 12 months, particularly in the movement against racism. You know, the Black Lives Matter uprisings that followed after the murder of George Floyd were something that I've never seen before. Millions around the world, black and white, united, demanding racial justice over in the USA, but also here as well. And that police and crime sentencing bill is an absolute threat to us all. And as Helen said, it is about creating division, criminalising the socialists, criminalising those who protest, who organise, who demand better. But actually what I find most toxic about that bill is its treatment in regards to Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities, criminalising trespass, making their way of life impossible. And racists are emboldened by that bill. The treatment of Gypsy, Roma, traveller people in this country is horrific. It is an acceptable form of racism, and it is a national disgrace. And racists are emboldened by that bill. I'm going to talk to you about a family that I've been with this week. The boy is called Dylan. His mum is called Jane. Jane has said that I can talk about what has gone on, and she wants the left to know, and she wants the left to fight for justice for her son. Jane is a single mother. She lives 3 miles away from me. She has 5 children. They don't have much. If I can tell you a bit about Jane, on my son's birthday, they came bearing gifts. Jane's a teaching assistant. She lived in a house, and maintaining the mortgage became too much. Jane's of Romani Gypsy heritage, and she decided to get rid of her property and move her family onto a piece of land that she bought about 8 years ago, to live out their culture and have a peaceful life. The racism that Jane experienced started on day one of trying to move onto that land. Locals blocked the local lanes around the piece of land to try and stop her being able to move a trailer onto that land. Her family had to remove a fence so they could get the trailer on, and the racists didn't win. Jane's family have experienced what can be just described as, you know, the most horrific racial abuse since they've got onto that land. They've had their chickens killed, they've had their polytunnels slashed, they've had glass thrown over where the children play and roam, they've had an incident of arson. Jane's reported every incident to the police. The police have completely failed in safeguarding that family. This Saturday, they wanted them to go to a community resolution meeting with the protagonists, those who've been making their lives completely unbearable. The police were treating this as nuisance neighbours, not as hate crime and racism as it was. Sadly, on Monday night, Jane's son took his own life the pressure of everything got far too much, and they are now in a situation. Jane's now in a situation where she's lost, you know, her firstborn, her 19-year-old son. The reason I'm sharing this is we're trying to fundraise for James' family, but the police and crime sentencing bill that is Priti Patel is using to criminalise traveller communities emboldens those neighbours. It emboldens those racists, and the attack on those communities needs to stop. So we need to fight that bill with everything that we've got, not just for Jane and her family, but for every single one of us, because it attacks us all. So we have to continue to fight that bill, but fight for freedom of expression, fight for freedom of speech, because we can only build a diverse working class movement that can advance the interests of all of us if we have the freedom to express ourselves. So thank you, Bernard. I'm going to pop a link in the chat now. If you are able to donate, please donate. Otherwise, please just share. Let's get justice for Dylan and make sure Jane's family are taken care of.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel, for those important comments. And I'm sure people will want to share that crowdfunder and publicize it as much as we can. And can I just say, before I bring the last contributor in, we've had a range of questions from Nina, from Bill, from Francis, from Emma, from Nicholas, from Christina, sorry. All of them extremely interesting and very important. And I'm anxious to try and get to that point. I'm slightly worried that we had intended that we would stop at 8:30 and not go on too long. So I'm just conscious about time. Please, John, don't take that as an instruction that you have to be short. You don't. You have your full entitlement to contribute as long as the other contributors, and all of whom I know people have been listening to with a great deal of attention, and I can follow that from the comments that are in the chat. So thank you to people who have put positive comments in the chat. They've been very welcome, and indeed all the comments in the chat. But just to give a warning to people who submitted questions, we may not get time to do justice in answering them. So I'm just giving you that alert. But it clearly just demonstrates the importance of the topic that we're discussing. I'm very pleased to introduce our concluding panelist, who everybody knows has been a key figure, leading figure on the left in Britain for some decades. I hope you don't mind me saying, John, as a leading figure in what is the most important anti-imperialist campaigning and internationalist body that there has been, and that is the Stop the War campaign. So John Rees. John.
Bernard, thanks very much. I'll be as concise as I can. I want to start off just by reminding people, in a sense, repeating what some of the points that other panelists have made about where the major threats to free speech come from in British politics at the moment. And I believe that they are increasing threats to free speech. Just let me mention some. The Official Secrets Act in this country, which is already a draconian piece of legislation, is coming up for review. If the government get its way, I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody attending this meeting, that piece of legislation will become even more draconian than it is already. Its ability to punish whistleblowers, for instance, will be considerably extended. Its power to reach into the economic realm of life as well as into politics will be increased if the government gets its way. I don't need to repeat what others have said about the police bill, temporarily stalled by the protests, but very likely to be back on the government's legislative timetable very soon. A considerable attempt to silence not only the right to free speech, but, and this needs saying, the right to free speech is a pretty weak right unless you've got the ability to freedom of assembly and freedom to demonstration to back it up. And that's exactly what the police bill is aimed at. Coincidentally with this, and this is some work that I've been involved in recently, there is the most important civil liberties and freedom of speech trial of the 21st century taking place. That's the trial of Julian Assange for releasing the cables which told us what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. If the United States are successful in their appeal, he will be extradited to the United States, charged under the Espionage Act, and could serve or be given a sentence of 175 years. Of course, he has no chance of actually serving that sentence because it would be, in effect, a death sentence for him. The Spy Cops inquiry, which Helen spoke powerfully about at the beginning of this discussion. I am also a core participant in that. I don't want to add to what Helen's had to say about it. I do just want to make this point. The single left organisation that I was in at the time had, just in London, 30, I repeat, 30 undercover police from that one squad monitoring its political activities, posing as its members, giving speeches at its meetings, being elected to positions within inside the organisation so that they could influence its debates. That's just the Special Demonstration Squad. It doesn't include the resources that would have also have been there from the MI5, from the Metropolitan Police as a whole, from the Special Branch, and it's just in London. Now that is a considerable attempt to influence political debate and to stifle the proper processes of political protest and free speech. And I don't want to pass on from this section of what I have to say without mentioning the anti-union laws, too little referred to, but the most repressive anti-union laws in Europe, which considerably damage the right of free association among working people and their ability to defend themselves at their workplaces. Now, I say all this not simply to dramatize the seriousness, and that's just some of the threats to free speech which exist at the moment, but also to suggest this to you. If the left is not 90% concerned with what state power is trying to do to freedom of speech, it's focusing in the wrong place. It may be true that the person standing next to you who's abusing you in some debate on Twitter is more irritating, but they are not a more serious threat to your freedoms. Only the state and corporations can take away your freedom, can jail you, fine you, or put you out of a job, and thus prevent you effectively expressing your views or organising in defence of them. So whatever we might say about the weaknesses, faults and shortcomings of freedom of speech and debate on the left, they are in a different register to those threats which can deprive you of your liberty or deprive you of your means to life. And therefore, if the left is to be taken seriously on the question of freedom of speech, it has to concentrate overwhelmingly on defending people from those very, very powerful forces in society, from the great leviathan of the state, which can behave in this way when no other body in society can behave in this way, with the exception of fascist organizations. I've spent a long time on the left, and my ability to freely demonstrate or to speak freely have only been physically broken up by police and fascists. And that's why the fascists are in a different league. They are primarily designed to prevent working people from speaking freely and organizing freely. Now, that said, of course, to be able to organize against those state incursions or corporate incursions on our freedoms, we need to be able to build the most unified and the most effective movement possible. And that requires freedom of speech. The left and the working class movement has no other means of compulsion. We can't deny you your job to force you to go on a demonstration or to support our political cause. We can't take away your liberty, bang you up in Belmarsh prison or any other jail. The only possible means of unity is freedom of discussion. Without freedom of discussion and freedom to persuade others to unite with you, we have nothing. We simply don't have the basis on which any movement can possibly be built. And that's why it's not just a morally correct thing to stand for freedom of speech. It's a functional necessity. It's a requirement of effective political organizing that the working class movement and the left generally adheres to the idea of freedom of speech. And I just want to say a few words about how I think that properly operates. You see, it can't be the case that we can divide the movement on the basis of our theoretical or political analysis of this question or that question. We have to accept that unity in action is unity in action between people who disagree politically and theoretically, even about the origins of the question over which they are uniting. So, for instance, we can agree, all of us, to be opponents of racism, to unite in practical ways to combat racism. But we aren't all going to have the same view about where it comes from. I've got a view that it's deeply rooted in the class nature of capitalist society. There will be liberals who are good anti-racists who don't share that view. There will be black nationalists who don't share that view. There will be third worldists who don't share that view. The whole point about unity is it is unity of people for the practical purposes of changing and challenging the society who don't necessarily agree on all sorts of theoretical and political analyses about where the problems come from. We can all agree that we want to combat sexism. Some people will do it because they believe in a patriarchy theory. Some people will believe that it's a Marxist theory that best explains it. Others won't believe either of those two things and will have entirely liberal views about why sexism ought to be opposed. They all have to be welcome in the movement, and they all have to be free to debate and argue their position within the movement. That's the only way in which a serious left, an articulate, intelligent, intellectual left, is capable of persuading others to join with it in fighting on the most important practical pressing issues of the day. And in that debate, let me just make this point. There is no way in which identity is a concluding argument in politics. You aren't right about racism because you're black. You aren't right about trade unionism because you come from a working class background. You aren't right about even any particular analysis of women's oppression because you're a woman. Of course, the experience of being working class or black or a woman is a vital experience that you can bring to the debate, but it won't settle it, because there are black Marxists just the same as there are white Marxists. There are black defenders of Back to Africa. There are black defenders of Frantz Fanon. There are black defenders of a liberal approach. For heaven's sake, a third of the working class votes Tory. So just appealing to your identity might be a relevant part of the debate, but it can never be a concluding part of the debate. Those debates are always settled by politics, by political analysis, different political strategies, and different successes or failures that they give rise to in the movement. So politics is king here. It's a political debate, and people have different political positions, and that's why they have to be free to express them. They can't be closed down by being told that they aren't the right identity to have an opinion. They can't be closed down because you believe that they're using the wrong language, or that they are acting in some way in bad faith. They have to be taken as having a valid political position, which, if it's wrong, it has to be proven wrong by superior argument, superior analysis, and a more effective strategy in the class struggle or in the struggle about other matters. So there is no way in which this corrosive process of introducing identity or language into the debate as if it were a closing and final, never mind about name calling, into the debate as if it were a final, closing and conclusive argument can possibly win. All that will do is impoverish the intellectual powers of the left, denude us in the face of our enemy. Because, and here's the final point, they have now got on to the idea of identity politics big time. All you have to do is listen to Mark Regev lecturing people in the Israeli embassy about how we have to attack the left using their own language, using the questions of racism, using the questions of democracy to undermine them. That attempt by the right to appropriate the language of postmodernism, the language of identity politics in order to undermine the left, and here's where I return to my starting point, can only be fought by understanding that this isn't just about freedom of speech, it's about power. And the threats to freedom of speech come from those with power and can only be properly challenged by those of us without power, binding together and organizing so that we do have the ability to challenge them. That requires the right priorities and the ability to defend the questions of freedom of speech, not because we are morally adherents of them, although we may be, but because they are a functional necessity of an effective movement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that very thoughtful contribution, John. Excellent. Can I just say to everybody who's on the call that Salma Yaqoob gave her apologies. She did tell us before the meeting began that she had professional commitments and a Zoom meeting that she had to go to. So she was really sorry that she hasn't been able to stay on the webinar. But thank you to Salma, and I'll convey the gratitude that people have expressed in the chat for her contribution to her. We were aiming to finish about 8:30. I don't want to go beyond that because I realise that there's a limit for all of us, I think, in our ability to sustain attention through Zoom meetings. Not that this is one of those occasions, because all the contributions have been extremely good. I've got just I've got 4 or 5 questions, but essentially they boil down to 2 issues. And what I'd like to do is to present them to the panelists and for them to use an opportunity to respond briefly to the questions that are there and make any concluding remarks that you wish to make. And I'll follow the same order that we had at the beginning, if that's okay with everybody. So the 2 questions that really, to bring them together, one of them is about the question of freedom of speech and whether or not the issue of no platforming fascists actually undermines the left's ability to defend the freedom of speech and actually is a mistake. That's a question that has been raised in a number of different ways by people putting forward questions. And the other question that comes up is about the issue of the gender identity and the Gender Recognition Act, and whether or not the caricaturing, I think that's a fair way of summarising the point that's being made, the caricaturing of the position of groups like Women's Place UK is leading to a closing down and a failure to debate other aspects to do with sex and gender, namely things like prostitution and so-called sex workers and things of that kind, and whether or not you have comments about that debate actually being influenced by the kind of no platforming and censoring that has taken place against spokespeople from Women's Place UK and indeed other people who have been raising the question of gender recognition and what that means. So those are the 2 questions that are there. Feel free to answer both or neither and to make your concluding remarks. I will take them in the order that we began with, if that's okay, unless anybody has a problem with that. So if that's okay, Helen, I'll take you first, then Naomi, then Daniel and John. Helen.
Yeah, I do think that the caricaturing of women's organisations, the comparison of them, for the labelling of women as bigots, as fascists, and the general climate of fear that has been created around women being able to speak on the gender identity issue has impacted on other women's struggles and ability to be able to talk about those issues. And explicitly, there are actually many women who have been prevented from speaking about other issues apart from gender identity just because of their views about gender identity politics. Yesterday, actually, there was a report issued into the University of Essex, the effect thereof, feminists being no platform for their views on gender identity politics, even where they were talking about other issues. And I would urge people to read that report and see just how critical it is of the censoring of women's opinions. Sorry, I'm trying to be quick. The other issue about fascists, I was actually in the public inquiry the last 3 weeks when there was a large amount of evidence about the battles in the 1970s between the left and fascists. And I think what people need to remember in relation to fascists was that at the time they were graffitiing people's homes, firebombing them. They were making threats against both immigrant communities and trade unions and other people on the left. And I think that basically, for me, where people are clearly instigating violence against other sectors of the community and suggesting that they do not deserve basic human rights, then that is when it becomes appropriate to step in and say, you know, people have got to be stopped before they gain the power to entirely wipe the rest of us out, which is what they, you know, what they seek to do in terms of, you know, their attacks on the left and on immigrant communities and on Black people more generally, and on women, indeed, feminists. So yeah, sorry, I'll that's probably enough. I'll let other people
Thank you very much, Helen.
have
Naomi?
time.
Yes, hi, what a stimulating discussion. There are a couple of issues here, aren't there? There's the question about whether adherence to the idea of no platforming for fascists has led us into the situation where we're seeing no platforming taking place within the movement. And there was another one, which I think is from Eric in Scotland, saying, why are the left colluding in this no platforming? I mean, I think John Rees has kind of answered this in a way, and I'm very cross with John because he used the word that I've been putting in block capital letters over my notebook. Question of power. This is what it's all about. If the left has a misunderstanding of the politics, if the left thinks that racism and discrimination is about, oh, here's a bad person who doesn't like gays, or here's a good person who fights racism, it's just about individual responses and individual feelings and individual offence and being of offence and taking of offence. And we cannot combat those ideas. It's a question of power. And that's why that's where I think what Helen said about no platforming with fascists was completely relevant and right. You know, there are times when the power balance makes it very clear that you have to take a stand and you have to say no at this stage, in this place, at this time. We are going to enforce no platforming for these people. There may be other times when we are too weak or where it's inappropriate for other reasons. So it's always a matter of judgment. It's about how you understand the politics and how you understand the power situation. We were asked to comment on the question of gender critical arguments, gender. I have to be absolutely clear, this is not Jewish Voice for Labour's area. Our area is to clear the decks for free discussion on all issues that are relevant to building anti-racist, anti-colonial, pro-Palestinian, and of course opposition to racism, including anti-Semitism. That's our area. So when we said after the rally where Esther Giles was no platformed, we do not accept no platforming as acceptable within our movement. Well, you can imagine we were attacked by people who take a certain view of trans rights as therefore being transphobes, because we had suggested that someone they have decided is transphobic. We had argued that she should not be no platform. We were also attacked from the other side, and there's someone on this call who will know exactly who I'm talking about, who suggested that because we had allowed the meeting to go ahead without that individual who had been no platform, we were in the wrong, we should have boycotted the meeting. So we sit kind of between two, you know, very heartfelt positions in our movements. And I think the arguments I made earlier and that Salma made so forcefully, that John has made, you know, that's where we stand. And, you know, so please don't go away and label us in ways that we have not deserved. I hope that's helpful. But power, politics, understanding and solidarity with across the movement, no cancelling of one another.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Daniel?
Thank you, Bernard. We'll start with the caricaturing of women's organisations. You know, we see a lot of this feminazi, you know, there are fascists sort of narrative getting pushed, and I think that's particularly offensive. You know, I've spent a lot of my adult life fighting fascism, and I've not met a feminist on the left who I would consider anywhere near a Nazi at all. And, you know, such a narrative isn't only offensive to the person who's on the receiving end of it, but kind of diminishes the experience of those who've been victims of fascist violence and attacks. It's completely disgusting, I think. At the end of the day, you know, there will be varying views on lots of things in our movement, and sex and gender is one of them. And we have to do our best to find a consensus. And there will be some areas where a consensus can't be found. And some of the discussion around sex and gender might be one of those areas, but it shouldn't be this great divider that means we can't work together, that means we can't means we can't work in the interests and have that unity in action. And I think it's really destructive, actually, because transphobia does exist, I think, and trans oppression is real, isn't it? And, you know, we can see that through statistics, unemployment rates, and, you know, how difficult it can be for them to seek health services, and sexism, you know, is absolutely very real and a real experience. And, you know, we're only going to overcome both if we can find that unity to fight together against a common enemy. And, you know, the women's movement is not that enemy, it's about that power, isn't it? So yes, I find those caricatures incredibly destructive. And then the position on fascists, I think it's an important position that the left maintains. We just have to be very clear on what a fascist is. It's about, you know, it's about violence fundamentally. We've seen in the Northeast a growth in fascism, but we've also come together to defeat that growth in fascism. You know, there's no more National Front, there's no more BNP, there's no more EDL, and so on. And that was through that collective solidarity. But if you don't act on fascism and fascists and you allow them to have that space to have their free speech, they fundamentally want to take away our free speech. And where they are allowed to grow, you do see the rise in racist hate crime, in violence. And we had women who had their hijabs removed on the forcibly on the metro around here, who were spat at. And that was at a time when the EDL were growing. And remember, Stephen Lawrence was murdered round the corner from a BNP headquarters, where the BNP was rife. You know, we allow them to have that space, and that's the result. So I think it is a correct position to have no platform for fascists, and something we should maintain. But we should have to be very clear on what a fascist actually is, because a fascist isn't a racist. And actually, if I do come across a racist, I want to talk to them. I want to have dialogue with them. But more than that, I want to pull them into a struggle against the common enemy, standing against on a picket line against bosses, or pulling them into an anti-austerity movement, and so they can identify what the real enemy is. So no, we have a very correct position on fascism, I think.
Thank you, Daniel. And John, you're mute, John.
Yeah, I don't want to add to what other people have said, Helen and Naomi and Daniel have said about fascism. I just say this: when I first became part of the left in this country, I was taught two things: one, what fascism is and why you oppose it, and two, don't go around spraying the word fascist to anybody you don't like. It devalues the meaning of the historical experience of victims of fascism. It confuses you politically about how to react to people in the present day, and it's stupid. So don't do it. It gets you into trouble. So I don't have any trouble. I think people who say they have difficulty recognizing fascists, I've never had that problem, because I'm not actually talking about people who are, individually in the basement of their house reading Mein Kampf. I'm talking about people who are organized fascists, who were members of the National Front, members of the BNP, members of the EDL, and were organizing collectively to try and stop the left from having freedom of speech, and trade unionists and others from organizing. So, and I can tell the difference between those and people who are just horribly right-wing and racist and hold those views and will debate them. One is a group of people that extends into the Tory party and the government. And the other lot are people who, not 18 months ago in this country, went up to a leading member of the RMT trade union and smashed a glass in his face in a London pub after a demonstration. And it's stopping that that I'm interested in when I say that there shouldn't be a platform for fascists. I'm not interested, and I'm not very interested in people who spray around the word indiscriminately on the left, least of all to apply it to actual people who are on the left and would oppose and do oppose actual fascists on the streets, like most women's organizations always have done. So that is an uninteresting and useless contribution to the debate as far as I'm concerned. And that goes for demonizing or abusing women's organizations because they have one view of the trans question rather than another. But I don't make the opposite error either. I don't think the people who are abusing women's organizations who claim to be speaking for trans people speak for trans people. I don't think they remotely speak for what most trans people think. They're a particular political current who have developed a particularly sectarian ideology and are using it to destructive effect inside the movement. And I think that would be a sensible attitude for us all to take. Why make enemies of a group of people who do face oppression unnecessarily because some people who claim to speak in their name talk outrageous rubbish and behave in unacceptable ways? That's not a sensible way for us to proceed. So I'm sorry if I stole the line off Naomi's notebook, but it is about power. And let me say about how this can be handled. I'll end with this. People may have seen Mike Rosen's posts in recent days responding to the fact that actually a lecturer, which just reinforces my particularly low opinion of the intellectual level of most academics, but a lecturer in Northumbria University put up a post superimposing the protocols of the Elders of Zion across Jeremy Corbyn reading Mike Rosen's Bear Hunt to a group of children. And what interests me here, I mean, all right, that you've got to be particularly warped to do that. Mike Rosen has called it out very effectively, drawn attention to it. I would say has humiliated the person who did it. And on the back of that, there have been some people calling for the lecturer to be sacked from Northumberland University. And Mike Rosen has intervened in that debate to say, no, I don't want him sacked. And I think Mike's absolutely right, because he's drawn the distinction between the freedom of debate to challenge that utter rubbish publicly when it comes out, and then calling on people i.e. the employers, who do have real power, who are our enemies, to intercede supposedly on our behalf to kick somebody out of their job for doing something which we all agree is absolutely wrong. And that's how, in practice, it's important to draw the line between those people who have the power to hire and fire, or have the power to deprive you of your liberty, and those people who simply hold views that we disagree with. And that, if we hold on to that, that would be a very good starting point in this debate, I think. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, John. I want to thank all of the panelists for their contributions. I think it's been an extremely interesting discussion, and the contributions have all been really weighty and really valuable. And several people have asked if we will be posting the video. Yes, we will. So it'll be available to people, and we'll put that information around. Everybody who has been on the webinar and who has registered will receive details of that, alongside the details of the articles which were published in the Morning Star, so you'll have a chance to read those as well. I'd ask you, in conclusion, please to sign the statement that we put out. We'll be putting it up on the internet so that people can access it, and it can be signed by everybody. We hope that it will go out widely. It's notable, and I fear I have to say this, that there's a lack of trade union and political MPs signing it. I think that's interesting. I think it shows how far the, if you like, the intimidation goes in terms of people not being brave enough to speak up. And that's something which has to be challenged too. But I thought this contributions from people was absolutely brilliant in terms of the exchanges, the sensitivity, the understanding of the complexity of the questions that were raised. And the thing that I'd return to is what we said from the very beginning, is that the biggest threat to free speech is, as Naomi and John have said, and Helen and Daniel, a question of power, and it's a question of the state. It's a small story, and I don't put it in the same weight of gravity of the experience that Helen had. But I was shocked when I was sent by a friend of mine copies of cabinet papers from the Conservative government in the 1980s, in which Margaret Thatcher was directing the civil service to look at what was happening in education, and specifically in the Inner London Teachers Association, where I was one of the officers, along with a number of other people who are on this call. And so this thing that John said, and I think is really important, and what's at the center of what we're talking about, and that is, I think the left doesn't appreciate the role of the state. It looks at politics through Parliament and thinks that it's only about Parliament. The state is an apparatus of considerable size, complexity, and indeed power. And what we've been talking about is the right to freedom of expression and freedom of speech in order to organize and to champion liberties for workers, for women, and for society in general. Thank you very, very much to everybody. I'm sorry to those of you who submitted questions which we didn't get to answer. I can only apologize for that. We will consider after this meeting what happens next. We don't have any plans. We came together very much as an ad hoc group, but with a common feeling and understanding about the issue of freedom of expression and freedom of speech as an important one. We'll reflect on this evening's meeting, and if you wish to send us comments, advice, suggestions, whatever, we'd be very happy to receive them, and there will be an email contact which will be on the statement that you will see on the internet that people will be able to sign. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Salma, who sadly had to go early, to Naomi, to Helen, to Daniel, and to John for the contributions that you've made. And thank you to all of you for having attended.